And today we are going to talk about the god and goddess before Wicca. But we're going to kind of tiptoe through the tulips a little bit and take a detour because I think people who are familiar with me and my work probably know that I tend to approach most of the world as if it has to have this kind of very academic, factual rigor, and there has to be this historical process through everything. And today is going to kind of break that a little bit because we're going to look some at how ideas can inform and relate to things when they're connected, even if they didn't necessarily historically feed into the creation of the current idea that we're dealing with. And so, for a simpler example on that, I want to start off looking at magical names in Wicca and neo paganism, because this is another one of those things where we probably have an idea of where these come from, or we have things that we've been told about where they come from, and that doesn't entirely track with where they actually come from. But when we start to unpack where they come from and when we unpack how they've worked in other types of systems, we can find ways in which that informs the use of them and can add a lot more meaning to what people do with them. So rather than these being some ancient inheritance from earlier paganism or earlier witchcraft, they probably come from the Order of the Golden Rosy Cross, which was a German Rosicrucian order whose initiations were essentially a metaphor for alchemy and informed the creation of the English Golden Dawn. They probably adopted it from some other Rosicrucian groups that use similar practices, and we can kind of see where early Rosicrucian writers did use pseudonyms, probably mostly for anonymity or to sound mystical and cool, maybe. But the idea, again, was delivered to the English Golden Dawn, and through the English Golden Dawn, it was adopted by Crowley's AA. And there is a very strong chance that Gerald Gardner was an AA member. And it's an idea that's not typically explored by most historians, but the way he presented some of the things that he presented and some of the things that Crowley and Gerald York sent to him would suggest that that was probably more of his involvement with Crowley than his OTO involvement. Because his OTO involvement, even though he technically was a seventh degree and technically had a charter to run the OTO in an area, he didn't actively do a lot with any of that. The idea of these magical names, they don't seem to be a folklore practice. Cunning folk didn't typically adopt magical names. Sometimes they got nicknames, like Mother Shipton or Thomas the Rhymer, and some of these nicknames were things that came after their lives. But they were kind of names that like people in the community might call them because of the work they did in the community, as opposed to names that they were adopting to separate themselves magically. The Society of the Mercurii, which existed about maybe like 20 years or so before the Golden Dawn, and actually is like really good proof that there was no need for a magical revival because there were active magicians doing like normal traditional magic in England at the time. They did have some use of magical names. It wasn't a consistent thing in their order as far as I can tell, but when they published, some of them would publish using magical names. And so it may have been something that at the time was kind of associated with learned magic as opposed to folk magic, or it may have been part of the way that leisure society in England looked at themselves as magicians and alchemists, because there was definitely a fashionable element to that in some circles. The SRIA, I'm sorry, do you have a question?
Society of the. I'm just trying to write it down.
Mercurii.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so no problem. The SRIA, or Societas Rosicruciana in Anglia, or the English Rosicrucians, they did not use magical names. And that was one where I thought that they would have, because they were such a direct influence on the Golden Dawn. But so that shows even some of the groups that directly fed into these groups that established this for us, it wasn't part of their process or their identification of what magicians or magical people did. It doesn't seem to generally have been an early modern occultist activity. Like if we look at excellent book of the art of magic, the authors who were relatively well-known high society members, and even somewhat important for history, they just used their names. They didn't use magical names. John Dee just uses his name, didn't use a magical name. It wasn't something that was a common part of our magical heritage. But grimoire authors did not write grimoires under their names, because the grimoires kind of tend to fall into the category of pseudo-epigraphical literature, where instead of, like, if I were living in the 15th century writing a grimoire, I wouldn't call myself Brother Fire and Ice and write the grimoire as being by Brother Fire and Ice. I would say the grimoire was by Solomon, or the grimoire was by Albertus Magnus, or Moses. Like, I would say some figure who was associated with magic wrote this grimoire, because it's in the tradition of pseudepigrapha, where you assign the writing to a famous figure in order to connect the writing with that figure in some way. And we're going to talk a little bit more about pseudepigrapha in just a minute. So where they come from isn't especially interesting. Where they come from is just, there's this German Rosicrucian group, there were some other Rosicrucians, and some high society people were like, this is cool, let's do this. So maybe if we look at why they were used, that'll give us something more interesting than where they came from. So obviously the thing that most people assume is privacy. And that's a big part of why people use them today. But you'll see people also go back and forth publicly and online between using their magical name or their legal name, or just whatever name people call them in regular life. So they aren't really protecting privacy in most cases. Or you'll have people who they kind of adopt using their magical name in their regular life. And so the use of a shield for privacy kind of stops at that point. Some groups require them, but they may be for more of a social reason than a magical reason. Then you have other groups that'll say, just like, if you want one, you can have one, but you don't have to. Okay, that doesn't make sense. Or there's the idea of transformation. If you're going through some initiatic process, and you want to say, this is a new beginning, this is a new portion of myself, then the name becomes a symbol of that. The thing where I was like, this doesn't make sense, the note was about power and access. And with that is sort of the idea of, like, if I'm BJ Swain, but then I also have my birth name of Brian, and then if I have my magical name in the Gnostic Catholic Church, von Hohenheim, the more of those names that you get, the more pieces of me you get, because each name has a different use and is used in a different context and refers to a different part of my life. And so there you're starting to actually get something a little more concrete in an esoteric sense, where you're saying, like, okay, if we divide this person up as a pie chart and we label each piece of the pie chart with a different name, then eventually we get the whole person. And if we want to draw on that person or affect that person, the more parts of them, the more complete thought form that we have of who that person is or what their identity is, the more we're able to kind of construct this or create this connection there. But again, people use a lot of these names in public. They're not ways of secreting away themselves. It's not like Sinbad and taking the heart and hiding the heart away in a box somewhere so you can't be killed, which is actually the cool idea of having like a dozen different names, is you hide 3 of them so no one knows what they are, and then no one ever can get full access to you. So there are some meanings possible there, but a lot of them kind of lack depth, and a lot of them sort of lack what people are actually doing. If we jump back to pseudepigrapha, though, which again is that idea that you claim the authorship of something isn't yourself, but the author is some famous, important figure in the tradition that the text is part of, there's some interesting ideas that we can deal with there. you can kind of write it off as creating a phony pedigree. But Dr. Charles Stang, who writes in looking at late antique and early developments of Christianity, has suggested that there's a connection between the idea of apophasis and anonymity. Anonymity. Apophasis is the idea that God is uncharacteristic and unknowable. And so by meditating on those lack of characteristics, meditating on the idea of something without identity, then you become closer to a direct experience of what the nature of the divine is, which is otherwise indescribable because it has no characteristic. If you take on an anonymity by giving up the ownership or creation of what it is you've created and saying that you are simply part of this current that these other authors represent, you're taking on this apophatic anonymity that allows you as the writer, as the experiencer of this process of creation, to become part of that sense of lacking self and lacking characteristic and expanding out into the overall divine context through which these things are processing and channeling. And so when we start adding something like that into the idea of like, okay, what are we doing with magical names? Maybe we're taking away part of this sense of the identity is about me as much as the identity is about the movement or the current or the experience. Then that allows us to step away from ourselves and open ourselves up to these experiences in a greater sense. It's that Doctor Strange, get out of your own way, it's not about you type of thing. And that's something where I know the group and the writers of the group can kind of be people that people don't like to talk about sometimes. But in the introduction to Volume 1 of the Introduction of Magic, which I bought before everyone was like, oh, those guys are bad guys. They talk about that's why the group members used magical names, is that they were saying the magic, the things we're writing about is important. We are not the important part of this. It was a way of sort of subverting ego in the process of creation and experience of magical work. If we look at the way magical names developed in the Golden Dawn, they weren't really names so much as mottos. And sometimes these mottos were used overall throughout the course of your magical experience, and sometimes they were used on a limited basis when you were doing particular grade work. And the idea of the motto is that, and this is something that I think is lost in a lot of the current Golden Dawn traditions, because unlike the AA, they don't have direct lineal communication like we do because we're cooler. the, the idea of your motto is supposed to be that the motto describes the work that you're doing in that grade and what you aspire to become through the work of the grade. The motto is part of the alchemical process of initiation. It's not just a cool phrase that you're taking on. And when you're taking on a motto that's going to go through the whole course of your work with the order, then again, that's sort of where you're saying, like, this is what I understand at the beginning as far as where the order is supposed to take me and how I want to exist within the space of the order, and I am going to grow into that name. And so as opposed to taking on a name that reflects a transformation that's happened, the name becomes an engine of transformation that is trying to take you along into this new space that you are going to be occupying. Now, our last example of a place where magical names do actually connect with witches and with how these processes have worked historically is baptism by the devil. And so we don't see a ton of magical name stuff in historical things about witchcraft. Historical examples of witchcraft and the trial examples. Trials have a lot of great material to pull from. A lot of times people are like, oh, well, it's just that's what the Christians were writing to make up things about witches, and so you can't pay any attention to that. In some cases, like if you're looking at like a lot of the trials in the continent, especially where you've got works that are talking about sweeping trials where they're wiping out whole villages, those aren't going to be super useful because those are just crazy people writing crazy people things. But when you start looking at the periphery, or when you look at smaller explosions of trials where they actually are having individual case histories that are surviving, a lot of those people were actually magicians. Some of them were actually what we would probably say were witches as opposed to other types of magicians as well. And so we can actually learn a lot about what actual witches did and what actual magicians did through looking at those trials and comparing them with other folklore that we know at the time. Now, the example of magical names don't have a lot of folklore to back this up, and it only shows up in a few trials. But the places where it shows up, the idea is that one goes through an initiation to be made a witch, and that initiation is kind of like a new baptism where you reject your church baptism and you become baptized by the devil, and then the devil does fun devil party sex things with you that give you power and make you into a witch. But in some of those examples, a new name is taken. When they take a new name in those cases, though, it's not like I'm Starfire Shiny Fox. It's like my name was Isabel, now my name is Janet. And so they're taking really normal names in those cases. And some of that may just be throwing off or confusing the magistrates by being like, oh, well, this is my name, but in the coven, I was called this other name, which is really the same as this other person that you've accused. And they were called by my name, and, no one knows what's going on. And so it could have been a way to just throw people off. It may have not been an actual thing that they were doing. But it could have also been a legitimate subversion of baptism. In actual Catholic baptism, you aren't just pouring water on a baby. You are initiating that child into the human portion of the host of heaven. The child is marked as a prophet, priest, and king through baptism. The child is given their name in the world of Christianity. Their candle is lit so that heaven sees them, and their name is written in the book of life through the process of baptism. The subversion of baptism, then, is the undoing of all of that, saying that this child is no longer the property of heaven. This child is no longer present in the light of heaven, and now they are present in this other space, and their name is written in the devil's book instead of the book of life. So there's an actual meaningful transformation there. You're removing the initiatory process that has pledged your soul in one direction and saying, in exchange for power, I'm going to move myself in this other direction, into this other space, and being transformed essentially into something that is other than human, which a lot of times is used in witchcraft writing to describe that witches are still humans in bodies most of the time. But they aren't confined to being exactly the same as the way the rest of humans are in terms of the spiritual makeup of their soul body. That the soul body of the witch is shaped differently, maybe has different components, has maybe had other elements grafted onto it that make it somewhat different. And this process of transformation, where witches are baptized by the devil and take on the devil's seed as a form of power within themselves, sort of a cold ignition of their witch fire. That is a process of actual transformation, where, again, they're removed from that context that the church has created for them into this new context of power. So for us, none of this tells us where magical names came from. We already kind of established where magical names came from. But it tells us some really, bitchin' things about what changing your name can do. These are some pretty cool elements where if one were to take a magical name and be like, okay, I want to take this name so that my work is part of touching the uncharacterized divinity of life in the cosmos and allows me to get out of the way of experiencing that, that can be really meaningful. If you're taking on a name because you're like, I want this name to describe what my process of initiation is, where I'm going, who I'm becoming, that can be really meaningful. If you're taking on the name because you're like, screw those guys up in the clouds, I want to be here and have the powers that are hidden in darkness, that can rock. So there's a lot of things we can do with magical names, which I think are a lot cooler than what a lot of people do when they just kind of adopt one because they see on the internet, oh, I'm supposed to have this magical name, or I read in this book, oh, I'm supposed to have this magical name. We can kind of do the same thing with exploring the idea of the god and goddess. And so this was intended to tee up that discussion, partially because it was still kind of a cool exploration, I think, but because it's a little simpler of a topic to look at. And so I want us to kind of take that same thinking of when early Wiccans were taking magical names, they were kind of looking at what the Golden Dawn was doing, but they didn't even really follow that process of I'm taking a motto that is going to be part of my process of transformation. They were just like, okay, part of initiation is taking a magical name. And then that has become even more diffuse and undefined as it's moved out into the rest of how magical names are used in the broader neo-pagan community. So even if those people weren't looking at like how pseudonymity and anonymity work as mystical processes, or if they weren't looking at how you are subverting your Christian baptism or how you are building a motto of transformation, we can still look at those things and readopt those things as part of the process, even though they're not part of the history of what we're actually inheriting. And that's kind of what we're going to look at with the god and goddess. We're going to look at some ideas of how that type of duality existed in the ancient and early modern world, and how it related to mystical things and to witches in particular, even though those are probably not the sources that informed it in the creation of Wicca and of neo-pagan theology. We are going to look at the development of how it came to be in Wicca and neo-pagan theology also, because that can also give some directions as to how to explore those things if you want to explore them and take them a little deeper than how they're often treated. Before we jump into the details of this, it was recommended to me that I should do my intro stuff and my plugging stuff in the middle instead of at the beginning and the end. How many people here are Avatar fans? Like Avatar: The Last Airbender? Okay, so I have my little like QR handouts, but I have some that are just the QR handouts and some that are with the Avatar stuff from the Avatar class I did at another conference. So I will hand out both types, and you can take whichever you prefer. Actually, I'm just going to hand out the Avatar one because the other ones aren't stapled. So if you just take one and pass one back. And so those have QR codes for where you can follow me on social media, where you can find my books and things like that. I have a couple copies of Living Spirits and A Familiar Unto Me, which are two of my books, in case anyone wants to pick one up this weekend. Unfortunately, the printer was not going to have things printed in time for me to get more copies or to get my newest book, Adjuring the Voice and the Glory, which Lynette kind of pointed out to me that maybe not a lot of people know about yet, but if you have heard of the Merkabah or the Chechalot, which is like the earliest practical system of Jewish mysticism, like centuries before the Kabbalah, this is one of the only books on the subject from a practical perspective for magicians. But it's kind of there's like sort of an academic paper exploring how to reconstruct those things. And then there's a grimoire showing that instruction as the second part of the book. That reconstruction is the second part of the book. So if you're interested in that sort of thing, that's my new book. It is a little bit of a non-beginner book. You kind of have to be familiar somewhat either with Judaism or with old magic and mysticism in order to get much out of it. My next book on dreams will be a little more accessible. All right, so again, this class today, not my normal typical academic, this is the history of ideas and this is how things have progressed type of thing. We're going to discuss ideas drawn from history without necessarily mapping how they progressed one into the other. And we're going to look at how you can still have those interconnections even if the ideas did not deliver directly from one idea to the next or directly inform it. Now, some of these ideas may have still been in the backdrop that might have informed Gardner and his contemporaries or other people who took these ideas after them. I'm not saying that they were definitely not familiar with any of these things, but we don't necessarily know that they were, and they don't seem to be woven in intentionally. But we are, again, going to look at some of the actual history of how these ideas developed, too. So to start off with, who are the god and goddess that we're talking about? Now, I assume most people at a conference like this are going to be familiar with that concept. But some of the breakdown that people aren't always as familiar with is that the god and goddess in capital W proper traditional initiatory Wicca and the god and goddess in post Scott Cunningham, really pre-Scott Cunningham. He didn't invent eclectic Wicca, but he solidified it into a thing. They're not the same thing. They're actually relatively different theologies. So in traditional Wicca, you have a specific but secret pair of individual deities. One is male, one is female. Sexual union between the two is an important element of their particular mystery. The goddess is often referred to as the goddess of love by early initiates. She tends to represent life, love, and fertility. The god represents death, virility, and transformation. The god projects power. The goddess receives power and shapes and expresses that power. Most people, even outside of initiatory Wicca, are familiar with the legend of the descent of the goddess, where the goddess, in her grief over the death of the god, descends into the underworld and encounters the god transformed into death, and she receives the power of life by being scourged by death. And so this myth is a myth is that process of the god is projecting power that the goddess receives, and then she is able to take that power and shape it into creation. So in a Wiccan context, the god is magic, the goddess is the one who does and shapes magic and presents magic into the world. In kind of our post-Wicca, neo-pagan witchcraft, or our eclectic Wiccan context, you have a more generalized god and goddess frequently, where you have kind of almost that apophatic sort of sense of a goddess who has very few characteristics, a god who has very few characteristics, because they're expansive in order to encompass all elements of masculinity and femininity, all elements that could be contained in any particular god or any particular goddess. And then that is sometimes taken on as a structure where various individual deities are viewed as archetypes or manifestations of the particular powers within this more generalized god and goddess. Whereas you'll also find other people who just say, like, okay, any god and goddess can be your god and goddess, but you have to have this pairing. And the pairing becomes the important thing, kind of in both setups, is this idea of the pairing. Now, are these concepts older? If we look a few years ahead of the development of Wicca, we have Aradia, the Gospel of the Witches, or the Vangelo. Now, the actual provenance of that text is very, very debatable. And I know there has been more recent research on the text. I have not seen it. From what I've heard, it doesn't necessarily establish anything showing that it is much older than Leyland or Leyland's source. But whether it is older or not, it's still older than Wicca. And it does set up that dichotomy with Diana and Lucifer by having a moon goddess and a solar god who are paired together. And then the witch goddess comes from that pairing of the solar god and the lunar goddess. And for the most part, the witchcraft is preoccupied with the lunar goddess in that case. So it does set up something that looks a lot like what we see later on in Wicca. Thelema also sets up a lot of what we see in Wicca. And again, Gardner, probably an AA initiate. Wicca pretty much looks like if the Order of Thelemites was witches, that's what Wicca would be. There was a lot of copying Crowley stuff verbatim in the early versions of Wicca, and then people talk about Doreen removing a lot of that. There's still a lot of it there. Some of it's reworded slightly. But there's also a lot of things that you wouldn't notice being similar unless you were initiated into both things. There's a lot of things that show up in Wicca that if you go through the AA and the OTO, you'll be like, oh, this is familiar. I know where this came from now. But essentially, with traditional Wicca, you've got in Thelema an alchemical god and goddess and a hermaphrodite. So just like you've got the god, the goddess, and the Drighten. They represent phases of initiation. The goddess represents the first degree in Wicca, the god represents the second degree in Wicca, and then the Triton is the third degree in Wicca. Basically the same thing in the Order of Thelemites and in Thelema. The Man of Earth relates to Nuit, the goddess. The lovers relate to Hadit, the god, and the hermit relates to Rahor Queet, the crowned and conquering child, or the combination of the two. So they're more about processes of spiritual development, alchemical principles, and fundamentals of creation than they are about actual individual personalized deities. They also kind of reflect the idea of a process of social development for society as a whole, or initiations for society. There is a ritual system based on the interaction of these three principles, which in Thelema is the Gnostic Mass and its prototype, the Supreme Ritual and Invocation of Hissa. Particularly the Supreme Ritual and Invocation of Hissa has elements that show up in various places throughout early Gardnerian ritual tradition. And the foundation of the Great Rite kind of comes from the elements of these two Thelemic rituals. So again, this ritual process that is based on how to use this theology as an initiatic and magical process exists in both systems, with one system being the prototype for it in the other. Thelema at its center has teachings on creation and alchemy based on sex and sexual imagery, which, again, without people being initiates, I'm pretty sure everyone has seen images of daggers placed into cups representing Wicca. And so we all kind of know that that is a shared thing between the two. If you look at Valiant's Witchcraft for Tomorrow, some of what she describes when she talks about the secrets of sexual magic very much relates to, if you look in Crowley's Liber Abba, there is a grimoire that I think it's Liber Kopf, where elements of the ovum as an actual physical thing as opposed to just a metaphoric thing are treated essentially the same way in what Doreen describes and what Crowley is doing in that ritual. The presence of a dying and resurrected God is central to both. A feminine principle receiving power from that divine masculine principle and birthing that power from the divine masculine principle is present in both. They essentially have the same theology, although the mythology that they use to describe that theology is different. If we look at more eclectic Wicca, the idea of having kind of an overarching god and goddess who are the house for archetypes probably comes mostly from published Wiccan materials using multiple names to describe the goddess as a way of saying, like, hey, this goddess has all these characteristics and we're not going to tell you her name, but we're going to talk around it by saying, like, oh, she's been called all these things because all these things have these characteristics that describe her. and then that being reinterpreted to she is all of these people, because the name isn't actually published. That's probably the actual arc for how you get there. But you also have in the AA materials that talk about how names for gods are used because they describe the characteristics of those gods, but that they aren't actually necessarily who those gods are. So in Thelema, when we talk about Horus or we talk about Nu or Hod, they're not necessarily the same as the Egyptian gods, but those names convey the ideas of the principles of these divine beings that Crowley's talking about. And so you get that as kind of a prototype for this idea of archetypes, that it's like, okay, these archetypes are all ways we can describe the nature of this god and goddess that are indescribable and bigger than everything else. Crowley also wrote about dying and resurrected fertility god of the seasons, and listed a bunch of different gods' names and mythological figures' names, and like they're all the same. So again, you have this kind of early version of that. But Crowley didn't invent that. That was something that was part of the anthropology of the time, and like we can see that in James Frazer and his treatment of this dying and resurrected god. Crowley also embraced solar phallicism, which I think was Richard Payne Knight. I want to say was the guy behind the ideas of solar phallicism, which takes sort of this dying and resurrected god thing and sort of combines the male sexual cycle, the sun and seasonal changes, agriculture, death and resurrection, death and procreation, and all of the world's mythology as if it's all one thing. And it's all about how the sun and the penis are the same. People were wild back then. But I mean, you still see that. That is very much the metaphor that's still used in a lot of what we deal with today. The Hermetic Kabbalah that the Golden Dawn taught, very much about this sort of universalizing archetype concept. And you also have the Ema and Abba, the father and mother at the top of the two pillars. Rigardi very heavily embraced that element of it. And in his writings, he describes setting up personal magical altars where you have basically a masculine candle and a feminine candle. He doesn't call it like a god and goddess candle like you would see in later Wiccan books. But if you look at his altar diagram and what he's saying to put on it, it's almost the same as what you see in kind of late 80s, early 90s versions of how to do Wicca at home. And so, like, a lot of your stuff from Dion Fortune, who was also kind of working out of a quasi Golden Dawn structure, a lot of your Rigardi filtering Golden Dawn stuff, that informs a lot of your kind of post-initiatory Wicca, eclectic Wicca. And when you look at the patterns of it, it's like, well, this is like identical to what these Golden Dawn people were doing. So we can really see like that's where this stuff comes from for the most part. But you also have things like Western interpretations of Tantra, where you have kind of your Shiva Shakti relationship, which almost inverts it, where the male figure is the cosmic material figure and the female figure is the energetic divine potential that brings life by running through everything. But it's a very similar relationship to the type of relationship that we see in Thelema and Wicca. But it might be similar because we as Westerners decided to read it that way, as opposed to it actually being entirely similar. And that's something that we do a lot, where we look at things through a lens that we've kind of established, and we say, oh, these mythologies are similar because we're looking for them to be similar. Like, if we look at Apollo and Diana, who, when I was a kid, they were kind of like, if you were looking at eclectic Wicca stuff, they're sort of your prototype god and goddess pairing. They're twins. Like, so, like, they clearly do not fit the pairing that Wicca has. But if we start saying, like, well, we're going to recharacterize them more like Diana and Lucifer from Aradia, then it's okay that they become this kind of sexual alchemy metaphor. The So it's like they clearly in the mythology don't have the same relationship that we're looking for, but everyone like picks up Scott Cunningham and is like, yeah, I can roll with this. Diana and Apollo can be this god and goddess. That's fine. So we look at it through that lens that we're expecting, the lens that fits what we're trying to do, and we kind of recharacterize what was. So some of what we're looking at when we look at these things in the past, it's maybe not the same thing, but we say that it works, and that can be okay sometimes. Now these kind of this attempt to find these sort of pairings, to me as a kid, that was part of what like started pushing me away from looking at things in like a Wicca or like a neo-pagan perspective. And as I got deeper into more reconstructed paganism, it's like, oh, there wasn't this like everyone has to have a god and a goddess thing. Like this is just not how the ancient world did things. Why did we all accept that it was? Well, because we were trying to do Hermeticism and we were trying to do Hermetic alchemy as a pagan religion, and that's again, it's okay. You can get a lot from doing that, but trying to project that back onto the ancient world doesn't exactly work. Most of what we see in the general theology of neo-paganism and initiatory Wicca is, again, it's Christian-informed versions of 19th century alchemical philosophy where they're reflecting ideas from the Hermetic text Parmenides and some stuff that's actually described in Genesis when we look at like how the word is creation upon this indistinct water that is present, essentially alchemical mercury. And so to really unpack the details of how the Hermeticism works and how the alchemy works and how the secret teachings of these 19th and early 20th centuries occult bodies work and how that feeds into creating this theology would be like a couple other classes. Like we'd have to dive in really deep to get into all the details of that, and maybe I wouldn't record it as I was like explaining to you like all of the secrets that like some of these initiatory orders have. Some of them I'm allowed to talk about because I haven't had those degrees yet. So, but we're going to switch gears a little bit and step away from Wicca and talk about witchcraft, which, again, I think most people these days understand that they're not really identical things. That Wicca was kind of looked at as the archetype of this is what witchcraft is for decades and decades because it told us that that's what it was. But I think now a lot of people understand that there are lots of other types of witchcraft. And there's even arguments about, like, did Wicca appropriate the word witch? Like, was there really a reclaiming of the word witch ever? Or were these people who weren't necessarily witches saying, you know, the witch is a cool identity, the witch is a cool archetype, let's take this because no one's using it. But then there were these other witchcrafts that really have nothing to do with what a lot of the modern witchcraft was. And so now we're kind of in a space where it's like you've got these different things that are witchcraft. And again, that can work. That can be okay as long as we make space for all of them. So witchcraft isn't necessarily duotheistic because witchcraft doesn't necessarily have a theology. It's not necessarily a religion. It could be a practice. It could be a power. There's lots of ways you can contextualize and understand what witchcraft is. But that doesn't mean that it can't work with those kinds of pairings because witches can kind of go do what makes sense and what's practical and what they want to do. And there are definitely points in witchcraft where we can see those sorts of pairings show up, even if it's not a fixed sense of the entire world operates this way. Let's see. I don't think we have to go through explaining what witchcraft is. I think we can jump ahead and talk about some of the historical examples. So Helios and Hecate. For me, these two were the first example where I was like, oh, wow, I think Gardner accidentally got it right. Like, because I don't think he was looking at the relationship between Helios and Hecate and ancient witches when he was developing his witchcraft. But when I first noticed that this is a thing in the Greek and Roman world, I was like, oh, well, now you have this, like, divine pairing of a god and goddess, and one has solar connect. One is the sun, and the other one has lunar connections. Well, there's some debate about where the lunar connections come in for Hecate, if that's an original element or a later element. So I really do not think that this influenced Wicca. But it is kind of cool when you think about how, like, you normally have that Artemis Diana pairing with Apollo in a lot of modern witchcraft. Now, for those unfamiliar with how Helios and Hecate connect to witches, in early mythology, Hecate takes Demeter to see Helios. Hades has kidnapped Persephone. Demeter doesn't know where Persephone is, and she's looking for help. And Hecate is like, "Oh, let me help you." Sometimes people are like, Hecate as the moon saw what happened because the moon and the sun see everything. But in this myth, there's no identification between Hecate and the moon. Hecate is still the torchbearer in this case, which is people kind of can connect that to, like, oh, the moonlight and the torch bearing, but they weren't necessarily the same originally. So as the torchbearer, she's able to light the way and help Demeter find where to go. But she did not actually see what happened. She heard Persephone cry out and was concerned by that, but she didn't. She doesn't know who took him. But she's like, Helios, he's up there. He probably saw it. So she leads Demeter to where Helios is. There is no element of this where she's like, let's go see my brother, let's go see my lover, let's go see my good pal Helios. It's just Helios probably knows, we can go find him. There's no special association between Hecate and Helios here. In fact, most myths don't imply any sort of particular relationship directly between the two of them. So we don't have a divine pairing where they're interacting to create something, the way that we see in later witchcraft. The way that they do pair up shows up in later writings where we see witch figures appear in mythology. So Circe, Medea, Erecto, all the various famous witches. They all have something in common. They're all descended from Helios. So in a Greek context, when we talk about heroes, heroes have to be semi-divine. So it's not just like you can go out and be super cool and you're a hero. You have to have a divine parent or grandparent, typically, in order to be a hero. So Jason, saddest dude in the world. He has the Argo. He's got a boat. So everyone wants to hang out on boats. So all these semi-divine figures come and hang out with Jason and go on adventures with Jason. And he's just a human. Like, that's got to be the lamest thing to be like, oh, all my bros, their dads or their moms are gods. And I've just got a boat. Even his girlfriend, who becomes his wife, granddaughter of Helios. Because he starts going out with Medea. Medea betrays her family and leaves with the Argonauts because she falls in love with Jason. There's points in mythology where they describe the children of Helios and how they have glowing golden eyes. There's a point where Medea and Jason flee and they go to Circe's island, and Circe is basically like, well, we're relatives, so I have to help you. But you betrayed the rest of the family, and that's kind of bitchy. So you can stay the night, and then you need to get the fuck out. Like, Circe's not having it. But, again, they're both descendants of Helios. They're both related to Helios, and so they're both witches. That fire, that sunlight that is in their blood gives them power, which is, again, reflected through that glow, that shining eyes that's described for them. While the witches are all descended from Helios, they're all taught by Hecate, and they worship Hecate. Now, Hecate's connection with witches and witchcraft, in the earliest forms of it, it's that she protects against ghosts, and she protects against witches entering into your home to bewitch you and curse you. She's the torchbearer. She is the one that stands at the crossroads at night and defends travelers. That's her original crossroads association. It's not originally a witchcraft association. Her shrines are at doorways and prevent sinister forces from coming into your door because she can slay sinister forces with her torches. This is kind of like the original Hecatean association with these dark agents of night. But this eventually becomes that she rules them as well, and that she is also the figure that they turn to for solace and for growth and for learning. She is a goddess who understands poisons and understands all of the powers of the herbs and the plants that witches use to create both healing remedies and poisons. And that's the thing where in like the early modern period, we talk about like, oh, they weren't really witches, they were midwives and they were healers. And that's not really true. A lot of times the midwives and healers were accusing the witches. And a lot of the people, you have some witches who they did that work also. And you have some witches who they just did their witch stuff and were just getting accused, but they weren't necessarily like the healer in the community. There were lots of magical things that people would go to magicians for professionally, aside from just healing. In the ancient world, though, the association with poisoning and witchcraft gets a little overblown. It's really an association with compounding medicines from herbs that's associated with witchcraft, and witches could use that to poison or to heal. And that was the danger of witches, is that they had the knowledge to do both, and you couldn't necessarily know which they were going to do. So in the context of Greek witch trials and Greek discussions about witchcraft, it is still largely that idea of you don't know if they're going to do good or bad, and they could do bad, and because they could sneak that bad in, that makes it even worse if they're doing bad. Like that's something like Plato and his buddies like talked about specifically. But so Hecate is the person that witches learn this from. Hecate is the person that witches learn to go into the underworld from. She's who they learn how to call up the dead and how to work with the restless dead, because the restless dead are her provenance and because she rules hell. So like she's the source for all the knowledge, the source for all the agency and authority to do the things that their powers as descendants of Helios allow them to do. So we don't have this idea of a divine pairing here, but we do have an idea of Helios providing power and then Hecate giving the witches the ability to shape that power and use that power. So there is something that's kind of similar to that sense of the god has this power and the goddess receives the power and then shapes it into magic. Probably not where Gardner got that idea from. He probably was not looking at this idea of like, oh yeah, maybe we're all descended from Helios and Hecate is going to teach us stuff. Because as much as like Hecate has been on a rampage for like the last like 10 years or so and has been whispering in everyone's ear, I've always been a part of every single facet of modern magic, and I'm in your witchcraft, I'm in your grimoires, I'm in your sorcery, even your Cyprian books, I'm really there too. Like, and everyone, like, you go into any occult space online, and I mean, like she and I, like, we're bros, like, we got our thing, but like, I will call that out that it's like she is not in most early modern grimoires, but even your grimoire bros are like, yeah, Hecate, she's everywhere. She's like the goddess that's in charge of all these sublunar spirits, and so she's important for the grimoires, and it's like no one was thinking that in the early modern period, and even like growing up doing witchcraft in the 90s, like Hecate would like get mentioned and there's like an awareness, but everyone was all about Diana and Artemis. There was not a huge Hecate thing, but now you'd hear it and people are like, yeah, it was all Hecate, going back to like Gardner, like, you know, every witch had like shrines to her, and it's like, No, that was not happening. But that is great that she has convinced us all that that is what the world is. It's all hers. And so, like, this is not the Aeon of Horus, it's the Aeon of Hecate. And that's fine. I'm here for it. Um, so, but in the ancient world, she kind of also did that then, too. Because if you look at the Greek magical papyri, by that point, Hecate is pretty much subsumed every other goddess. So almost any goddess referenced in the Greek magical papyri, except maybe Isis, but maybe also sometimes Isis, they're talking about Hecate. So like when they're like, oh, here's this spell for Artemis, and you're like, okay, I'm going to invoke Artemis. Three-headed Artemis with the head of a frog and the head of a bull and the head of a. What is going on here? Why is Artemis like being described? Oh, because it's Hecate. It's like, oh, Aphrodite is in this love spell. Why is Aphrodite ruling crossroads and carrying oh, it's Hecate. And like, and that was a thing that like wasn't just in the PGM. By that point in late antiquity, there were lots of elements of Greek thinking where Hecate was essentially the essential goddess. Helios, or kind of this combination of Helios, Zeus, Mercury, Hades, and a little bit of Dionysus, which when you start looking at the syncretism between Greek and Egyptian gods in that period, it's not really that weird because like they were all kind of being syncretized that way. I feel really dumb because the name is escaping me, but like the god with the flower pot on his head, important late antique Egyptian figure, had a temple. Serapis. Serapis tends to be described as a syncretism between Osiris and the Bull of Apis. But when you look at Serapis's iconography and the way that Serapis was, and Serapis is basically just like by mandate created by the Ptolemies. But Serapis over time has some Hades elements, some Zeus elements, some Helios elements, and a little bit of Mercury and a little bit of like Dionysus thrown in there. And those gods all kind of related in Greek mysteries already. But that's kind of the god of the PGM, the Greek magical papyri. You also have like Bes, or the headless god. But a lot of your divine figures, a lot of your references there, it's this kind of Helios that incorporates these other divine figures as well. And so through the magic of the PGM, again, you have this kind of weird Hecate Helios relationship going on, where they're not usually used in spells together, but somehow the two of them have decided they rule all of magic at this point in history, and the magicians have just kind of gone with it. Which I think is kind of like from like if you're describing history as an animist, it makes sense to sort of look at, okay, there's going to be points where we can see like the gods or the spirits decided this is how we want to interact with humans, and then you can look at what the humans are doing and it's like, okay, well, the humans went with it. So the PGM kind of reflects that. The PGM, there is some sort of process going on where these gods have kind of subsumed things, and these become the two major archetypes, the major figures that all the other gods are kind of reflected through in that context. So again, we have that Helios Hecate pairing in a magical context in the ancient world. They don't necessarily interact, but they are the two main deities that magicians are kind of understanding other deities through. This almost definitely was not something that Gardner and the other framers of early neo-paganism would have been aware of, because the PGM at the time was only available in German or Greek, or Demotic, and so they wouldn't have had it. They would have had very limited pieces of it that wouldn't have been enough to explore it and see this trend through it. This is a trend that people have really kind of realized in the last several decades, but so it wouldn't have been something they would have been aware of there. Kind of stepping away from that, Hecate, still with Hecate, but no longer with Helios. Hecate and the father. So in the Chaldean oracles, Hecate Soteria, Hecate the Savior, or Hecate Epiphanos, Hecate who appears to us. Hecate is the ultimate mother of the cosmos. She is, in this context, the clearly most important divine female figure. And Hecate pairs with the father of the cosmos. And so they essentially have kind of a Trinitarian theology here. And this, in the Chaldean oracles, which I want to say are like first or second century CE. I don't think I didn't put a date in here. Or they may have been a little earlier because they were considered to be one of the most important texts by late Platonists. So the Chaldean oracles and the Orphic hymns, those were two of like the ultimate things you could study as a Platonist outside of the writings of Plato or the fragments left from Pythagoras. There's even there's a story in Life of Proclus where he's being interviewed to be the head of the academy, so like the top Platonist in the world, and he's like, "Oh, excuse me, I have to go," and he leaves and he finds like a little alley, and he does a shrine in the alley in a celebration of Hecate because it's the dark moon, and then the other people interviewing, they follow him and they see what he's doing and they're like, "Oh, good, you're a pagan, you're not one of those Christians." And he's like, "Yeah, I had to sneak off to do this because you never know who's a Christian these days." But Hecate was kind of the chief divine female figure that they looked at, all other goddesses, because the Platonists had this idea that you've got kind of your peak underneath the divine that is unknowable, and so you've got aeon, sort of space-time, and then you have your earliest iterations of the gods, and then you have this kind of chain of being that descends and everything manifests from there. And the top of the chain of being on like the divine feminine side of things for them is Hecate. And that idea reflects in the Chaldean oracles, where the trinity of creation, you have the worker who kind of builds everything in the world. You have Hecate as the mother who mediates between the worker and the father is sort of the cosmic source of everything. And the father is the spiritual fire that life and creation are made from. Hecate receives the spiritual fire, shapes it into individual souls, and then allows them to be put into the world by the worker. So again, you have this idea of this divine masculine figure as a source of fire and light and motion and life. The divine feminine figure receiving that, building that into what is going to exist, and then putting that forth into creation. Now, in this case, there is then the worker mediating it, who actually creates with it, as opposed to her being the one that is fully creating from that place. She's kind of laying the foundation of creation. But this is one where Gardner and company may have had access to it because Wynne Westcott, one of the founders of the Golden Dawn, had done a translation of the Chaldean oracles. And so that was something that was available and published at the time. Now, as much as Hecate is awesome, the devil and the queen of Elfame. This is one where it's kind of like, it's very possible that there is a direct influence on Wicca and early neo-paganism, because this is folklore that existed in England and people would have been somewhat aware of it. And there are folk figures in England that were important, that shaped English history and shaped English politics even into the modern era. Like Thomas the Rhymer's prophecies were like major shaping force on the development of England, and the Queen of Elfame is central to the story of Thomas the Rhymer. So these are things that they would have known about. These are things that would have still been active in the folk culture of cunning folk who would have still been alive and still active at the time of the revival of witchcraft. Because again, a lot of these revivals were sort of people who weren't part of what was going on, who are like, "Oh, we need to revive this cool magic stuff that no one's doing." It's like, dude, Tom down the street is doing all this stuff. No, he's not. No one's doing this. We're reinventing it. So, in the credible accounts of witchcraft in the trial eras, they tend to involve people with a preternatural ability to connect with spirits. These people often can travel to spirit places. They gain benefits through their relationships with these spirits in these spirit places. There are examples of this in what is now Italy, what is now Switzerland, what's now Germany, because those were all just the German Empire back then. Eastern Europe, Iberia, and the North Atlantic Isles. Versions of this also appear around the entire world in recognizable forms, just contextualized differently. In the European examples, the spirits are often some sort of fairy or other local magical creatures. So, like, if you get out into like the Balkans, then they have like star dragons instead of fairies doing this, which is kind of cool. But I think they have fairy stuff too, and there's also like sort of your vampire witches. But these things are later conflated with devils in the trial accounts. And what you kind of have to understand about devil in the early modern period, you've got the big D devil, like the devil who is the adversary, who's like lurking in the corners waiting to take your soul. But then devil was also just kind of like any spirit that is probably naughty. So demon for a long time still retained its Greek element of referring to spirits in general. And while very early on it started taking on negative connotations, you still had up through about the 16th century where you could have spirits that were described as demons in some texts who might be described as angels in other texts or just as spirits generally in texts. So there was kind of still that interchangeability of the term demon. It didn't always mean a bad spirit. Devil started getting more specific, where you're dealing with spirits where it's like these spirits are evil or they're infernal or they're at the very least going to misbehave. And you see witches, devils being referred to also as imps, which again, just as a spirit that's going to be naughty, it's a spirit that's going to misbehave. So devil didn't always mean you're dealing with the adversary. Devil didn't always mean that it's like the archfiend or the ultimate power of evil. You could have the folk devils who were local spirits that were kind of in charge of nature and the world in that space. And you could have your individual devils, like your familiars, who were just the spirits that like went around with witches and magicians. But because these spirits would go and do things that weren't necessarily okay, and because they wanted certain types of interactions with their witches or their magicians that were not permissible in the eyes of the church, they're devils. So devil doesn't always mean ooky spooky evil. But it was a way that they could classify all these spirits because like early modern Christians were really bad at spirit classification because spirit classification is really, really hard. So people would come in and they'd be like, yeah, I went and I hung out with the elves, and elf and fairy and all those terms also completely interchangeable at the time. And so they're like, oh, they were hanging out with devils. These like spirits that they want to party and have sex and destroy livestock and do things we don't want them to do. The witch's Sabbath. When you look at the continental examples, a lot of times it's a goddess in charge of the Sabbath. It's not necessarily a male figure. Now, in like your sweeping, we're going to kill everyone in the village witch trials. It's a smelly, goaty devil who just wants to run through everyone and do every naughty bad thing, and he is basically the archfiend. But again, those are like the fever dreams of Christians who were probably kind of turned on by these stories. That is a theory that you will actually see in like why some of them were pursuing this so badly. when you get less crazy accounts, then a lot of times it's Diana, it's Abundia, it's Satya, it's these goddesses or Frau Holda, who are, they have at the very least the names of goddesses from the regions that they were in, or the names of goddesses whose mythologies are known in the regions they're in. They don't necessarily behave the way these goddesses did or do the things these goddesses would have done, and they're often somewhat interchangeable, even though these goddesses wouldn't have been interchangeable. But there's a way that these names, at the very least, survived in folklore and are often also kind of associated with fairy beings. Like in early modern England, Hecate has her spooky, ghosty stuff and her witch stuff, but she's also kind of associated with some of the fairy beings, like Nick Nevin, who is sort of in this space between being human and fairy and sort of ghoulish monster. There's a relationship between Nick Nevin and Hecate, and they're referenced together in some spaces because it's that kind of weird fairy interchange that a lot of these goddesses were adopted into. In fact, the word fairy comes from the word fata and referred to fates, but these fates were the sibyls, they were the oracles, who were sort of other than human magical women who could see the future. And in early stories where we see fairies in the chivalric romances and epics, the fairies are basically witches. They're queens. They're powerful women of the court who have magic, and they're basically human but sort of other than human. So like Morgana Le Fay and her sisters and friends, they're the witches in these stories, but they're described as fairies because witches in that context were, again, these other than human people who had these access to magic and spirits. And so you've got this overlap that happens throughout Europe in the late medieval and early modern period, where there's kind of an interchangeability or a connection, at least, between fairies and witches, where either witches consort with fairies or fairy-like beings, and they get their powers from doing that, or fairy is sort of used to describe these humans that have these powers and have this consorting with spirits. And so these goddesses that we see tend to be connected with that. We even see a witch cult in early modern Italy that works with Diana, and they do fairy magic working with Diana. It's the local fairies that these witches see and these witches interact with. And those witches were not a concern to the magistrates. They're like, oh, well, they're not hanging out with the devil. They're hanging out with this goddess, and they're hanging out with fairies. They're doing things they probably shouldn't be doing, but we're not going to kill them. We don't really care. You ladies go do what you're going to do. So there's always this blurring, there's always this overlap. When we get to the North Atlantic Isles, which is dealing with a lot of this stuff a lot later than the continent was, we see the devil and the Queen of Elfame. And so there's your blurring with the fairies, and you've got this fairy goddess figure who is important to the Sabbat, but she's paired with the devil figure at this point, as opposed to, instead of a devil, we've got Diana or we've got Abundia and we've got a bunch of fairies running around with a goddess at a banquet. Here, oh, the goddess lady who has all the fairies and the devil, they're buddies, they're pals. They put on these banquets together, and the witches go hang out with both of them. And often it's either the witch meets the devil, and the devil introduces them to the Queen of Elfame, or the witch meets the Queen of Elfame, and she introduces them to the devil.
Just a quick question. Does that concept of giving tips the fairies have to steal humans to give tips to the devil come from?
So that actually we're gonna mention that. So we'll get there in a moment. So who is the Queen of Elfame? When I first encountered this term, people were like, "It's this female magical figure. No one's really sure who she is or what she is." And it's like, you look at it, it's like, she's the Queen of Elf Home. Like, that is literally what this word means. She's the queen of the place where the elves live. She's the queen of fairy. She's the fairy queen. You don't see that as often now, where people are like, who is she? What is this word? I think people now understand that it's a really easy word to parse. But sometimes she exists separately from the devil, like in the story of Thomas the Rhymer. Usually the devil's not a part of that story because it's a 13th century story, and witches and hanging out with the Queen of Elfame and gaining powers, no one was concerned about it. It wasn't evil then. You didn't have to make it into evil then. Sometimes she will exist with a devil-like figure. Like in the case of Andro Man, he doesn't meet the devil, he meets Chrysinde, who is God's godson. But he's basically Lucifer. He's like an angel of light that teaches magic. And somehow Andro Man, well, not somehow, Andro Man being a person who is not highly educated, not deeply entrenched in the teachings of Christianity, but aware of folk Christianity, because that's what you would have in the wilds of Scotland at the time. He doesn't connect like, oh, what I'm describing is what they're going to say is the devil. It's this angel of light that teaches me magic and hangs out with this fairy queen. And then other cases, she exists with the devil, like in the trial of Isabel Gowdy, and most witches who describe her, she's right there with the devil throwing these parties and banquets. And that's the big thing that they do. They have these banquets. The witches come and party at the banquets with their imps and the familiars. She also has sex with the witches, and they get powers from the sex with her, which is the same thing the devil does. They are basically identical figures, except that one is male, one is female. They're both sources of power and agency and sources of spirits that the witches interact with. So neither one seems particularly in charge in a lot of these cases. Sometimes I have had the impression that the Queen of Elfame is the one who, like, when they go into the fairy spaces and they're having the banquets, that it's like it's her space. She's the one that's in charge, but it's not something that's ever expressed in the accounts. You just kind of get the vibe that it's like, oh, the devil took us there, and the Queen of Elfame hosted this banquet, and we did all these things, and all these weird fairy things were happening, and she's the one that's got it going on, and he's just kind of there, which is probably not what the Inquisitors wanted to hear, or not Inquisitors, they weren't the Inquisition, but the magistrates wanted to hear, because they wanted the devil to be the one that's in charge and is the bad guy. The devil also tends to give fairy things. The devil's not like, here's some hellfire. The devil's like, here's some elf shot. The devil's not like, let's go into the other world and we're going to hang out with Cassius and Brutus. It's, let's go into the hills and see frolicking fairy bulls and hang out with elf boys. Like, everything going on is a fairy thing. Nothing about it is diabolical in the sense of going into the inferno, going into the spaces that Christians would have associated with hell and damnation. Now, who the devil is and why he hangs out with the fairy queen. Elfhame is described as being adjacent to hell. And so, like, has everyone either read or seen Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell? Like, so there, at least in the TV adaptation, there's a point where the fairy gentleman describes learning a dance of three people when he was on the other side of fairy visiting hell at one point. And so you've got that same idea that it's like, okay, you go into fairy and you can cross through fairy, and if you get through fairy, you get to hell. In Thomas the Rhymer, Thomas sees the fairy queen and he thinks that she's Mary, the queen of heaven. And then she's like, no, I'm going this other direction. And he's like, are you from hell? And she's like, no, I'm from Elfhame. I'm from fairy. And so, like, the two are in the same direction. They're in the same sort of space. So that kind of gives this basis for, like, why the devil and why the queen of Elfhame would know each other and have this interaction. In Scotland, the fairies were supposed to tithe to hell. Now, where this comes from, I don't know that it's fully established, but my assumption on that would be that there's kind of a crossover between the world of the fairies and the world of the dead, going back even into the medieval period where you're getting closer to the pagan versions of this. There are points where the way the dead are described, the way the fairies are described, they're almost interchangeable. Bessie Dunlop's familiar is a dead man, but he's a dead man that was sent to her by the Queen of the Fairies. So there is this overlap between the space of the dead and the fairies. And so when you look at that, if the Queen of Elfame is kind of this Hecatean figure almost that collects the souls of the dead, collects the souls of the restless dead, in a Christian context, it's like, well, why does this woman get to hold onto the dead? Why does she get to hold onto the souls? Oh, she has a deal with hell where she gets to keep these and she has to pay a tenth of them to hell periodically. The story of Thomas the Rhymer, that's why she sends Thomas the Rhymer away, is because she doesn't want to have to give him to hell if he's one that's chosen in the tithe. So I think this is, again, part of establishing the adjacency between fairy and hell and the adjacency between the fairy queen and the devil, which is probably largely to malign or undermine the power of fairy, as there is like a history of undermining that power, but also either making it completely powerless to the point where it's not a threat, or it is a phantasm that is hiding the powers of the devil. And so those are kind of two movements that, particularly when we get into Protestantism, that there's like pushes to do those two things because they don't want there to be these other powers in the world. Whereas Catholicism had a lot more space for there to be these other powers in the world, and it's just they're kind of under the umbrella of what happens in the created world, and God lets it all go on. Just like people have power to do different things, there's these other magical beings that have power to do different things as well. So if Elfame and hell are near each other, if the devil is always going into Elfame, if everything the devil is giving witches is elf shit, maybe the devil is just an elf. He's the fairy king. He's not ooky spooky goat man. So what do fairy kings do? Fairy kings like the ladies. Finvara kidnaps women and takes him to his fairy court. And then they just party and have banquets and dance all the time. Which again, like they do a really good job showing that in Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell with the gentleman taking Lady Pole and then taking Arabella. The behavior between the fairy kings and the devil overlaps a lot. This desire for human companionship, this desire for sex with humans, the giving of gifts and boons in exchange for these relationships with humans, or even in exchange for like regular friendship and trade with humans. Like in one of the Finvara stories, before he steals this lord's lady, he and the Lord have a relationship where the Lord gives him casks of wine, and then Finvara blesses the Lord with various other good things until he steals his wife. So this kind of relationship of establishing power through these interactions with fairies, it's not just female fairies that this happens with. You have this with male fairies, you have this with the fairy kings as well. And given that everything that the devil does in North Atlantic witchcraft ends up relating to fairy spaces and fairy powers, he's probably the fairy king and not Lucifer. Now, if we look at this mythology, could this produce the Wiccan Sabbath? Yes and no. You definitely have this idea of like there's these banquets, these parties, and you have a powerful male figure and a powerful female figure who sort of rule over all of it. You don't see a lot about the fairy queen and the devil coming together as a sexual pairing, though. They have sexual relations with their witches, and the witches gain power and gain benefit from that. So there's a bit of a different relationship there. The pieces are there, again, in terms of that that powerful male, powerful female figure, and sort of your space where they're coming together for a party. But also, they're parties, they're banquets. It's everyone is like getting drunk and dancing and having fun and merriment, and then they're like, you know what? The lord of the manor, he's not treating people nice. Let's kill his children. And then they do some cursing. Or they're like, we need stronger beer. Let's steal the power of the ale that the brewer is making over there. And so it's like they get together and they do very practical magic while having these like parties where everyone's just cavorting and having fun. It's not, let's get together and explore the deep mysteries that are alchemically transforming our spirits. And I say that in a way that's like kind of like sounds like it's making light of it. That is cool too. It's just a very different thing. It's not what these early modern witches were doing. It's not what the Devil and the Queen of Elfame were doing. But there's definitely an echo of the sense of, okay, we're going to get together in secret. We're going to enter into these secret magical spaces that regular people aren't entering into. We're going to deal with spirits in these secret magical spaces. And there's going to be a major female spirit and a major male spirit that are in charge of these magical spaces. So there is kind of an overlap and a comparison. And so you could have something where you draw from that folklore, you draw from that history, and you draw from these kind of modern practices, and you're like, how can I put that together into one thing? And that's been going on since like the 60s, because that's kind of what Robert Cochrane, and who was probably a Wiccan initiate and was probably just doing spookier Wicca, what he was kind of advocating was like, yeah, we can do this thing that's kind of like this, but maybe the spirits that are actually the spirits of this place, like the spirits of this land, maybe those are the spirits we should be talking to. And as that progressed through the traditional witchcraft community, that is kind of more of what they came to. There's still that kind of structured, almost Masonic conceit of we're going to have a secret order that does these set rituals and gets into these spaces with these set rituals in that community. And that's kind of where, like, again, if you've seen some of my writings on witchcraft, I'll distinguish between historical or hereditary witchcraft from traditional witchcraft, where it's kind of like, yeah, no, you just go and like you get some power with some spirits, and then you go and you hang out with spirits and do these weird magical things with them, as opposed to you learn a bunch of structured rituals that you have to do and repeat in this way. But there's no reason that you can't use those structured rituals to do these things. And that's, again, kind of the overarching point of exploring this, is we can look at these ideas like what the trials and what folklore tell us about the Devil and Queen of Elfame, what witches get from them, what those relationships look like. We can look at the Chaldean oracles and look at like, oh, well, this is a way of modeling this kind of masculine principle and this feminine principle. And we can also we can break out that verbiage, because there is definitely like an element of like now where people are like, we don't necessarily want to look at things gendered, so maybe Wicca doesn't work. And you can kind of say like, okay, but those polarities, they still exist polarities exist. Polarities don't necessarily have to be about human sexuality. So we can still address those polarities. And then we can have other mysteries that are not about those polarities. And we can do all kinds of cool things. But you could also just say like, okay, we can talk about these polarities in different language, where we're not saying masculine and feminine anymore, where this is the projective polarity, this is the receptive polarity, this is the motive polarity, and this is the shaping polarity. So we can have ways where we can explore those things and bring them into the mysteries we're doing and look at how they inform these other mysteries that have developed in the modern era. We can look at how we look at the process of power transferring from one type of divine source, and then power being shaped and taught from another type of divine source. So we could go into something where we do something that is completely following, like you could pick up Scott Cunningham's Wicca Guide for Solitary Practitioner and be like, okay, I'm doing this ritual structure, but from now on, Helios is the god, and I'm calling Helios to receive power and over time be transformed into this powerful being by Helios. And Hecate is the goddess, and I'm calling her to teach me magic and show me how to use magic and give me access to spirits. So you can say, okay, I'm going to take these modern things, and even though these modern things were not using these historical setups, I can reinvent these modern things with these historical setups and take them to a space that they wouldn't have taken me to originally. And so that's kind of part of going through this is with the ritual that Sarah Maestros and I will be organizing tonight, having some background on this idea of the witch's devil and that like diabolical witchcraft is not necessarily evil ooky spooky the adversary witchcraft, although our ritual is going to be evil ooky spooky ritual, but it's going to be awesome and you should be there. The So this gives a little bit of background for that, but in a more general sense, again, the point is, can we explore some of the historical modalities that have informed magic, been part of magic, been part of esoteric spirituality for centuries, but maybe have not been part of what modern esoteric spirituality was doing? And even if we want to keep that modern esoteric spirituality, are there ways that these can work together? Or are there ways that maybe we say, like, you know what? The modern stuff is cool, but I want to go do this older thing? Or maybe you can be like, it's kind of cool knowing the older thing and knowing that the modern thing is not actually old, but I still like the modern thing and I'm still going to do that. There's lots of choices on the table for people, and you can kind of mix and match and build and integrate. But having the pieces and knowing how the pieces either fit or didn't fit originally, and kind of where things came from and what was, gives you a lot more options than kind of just saying like, oh, well, this is the thing we have now, and we're going to kind of pretend that this was always what was there. All right, so that's pretty much what I've got for today. I think I'm only 1 minute over, which is amazing for me.